Welcome to what is arguably my favorite unit of the entire semester. Don't get me wrong, I love the diversity of life. I actually really like cellular respiration. I like everything I get to teach you guys. But I am an ecologist by study. So my master's degree was in behavioral ecology, and my undergraduate degree focused a lot more on ecosystems and interactions of organisms. And so this is what's near and dear to my heart. This is a topic that I absolutely love. And we've been leading to this all semester. Everything that we learn is connected. And I hope you've been following along with that on our lectures, on our university detour of living world. We've been working through connections on everything we're talking about. The things from cells all the way up through genetics, all the way up through the diversity of life in animals, whether it's mammals or fish or whatever we're talking about. We are all connected, and ecology is kind of this nice big clean bow on top of everything, but it's huge. My goal for this particular unit is to try to get us to move from an egocentric viewpoint of the humans are dominant planet, we are the ones in charge of everything, we are the ones that are making decisions, we are the ones that things are here for, to more of an ecocentric viewpoint where we're moving into how are we connected? What is the importance of that connection? And how does that play a role in my health and well-being? So, with that being said, let's talk about ecology on a basis so that we can get into some of the bigger picture at the end of this unit. So we're going to go through biological organization, some of the ecology itself and environmental science, and then just some of the factors of populations that will help us understand the next chapter. To start, the science of ecology. One of the things that I really like about ecology is that if you've ever watched a nature documentary and just been amazed at the way these organisms are eating and working with one another and the things that they are struggling with on a regular basis, you have been a part of observational ecology. When we are walking around and we see a squirrel eating a pine cone, that is ecology. So, ecology is the study of interactions of organisms with each other and their physical environment, but it can be both a laboratory science and an observational science. And what's actually becoming really cool is since I was in school, so like 12, 15 years, I don't know, some time ago. um, there's been a really big shift in ecology to be more integrated within agricultural purposes, within human health purposes, moving into more of a one health, one world sort of mindset. USGS has a great source here that I put on the slide specifically because it's so good on the idea that we're only as healthy as our ecosystems. For a very long time, we have been removing ourselves as humans from the natural world. One of the quotes that I remember when I was in school that stood out to me was, just ignore the environment, it'll go away eventually. And that just like resonated with me because here I am in my office with my computer, with my headphones, with my stuff, removed from nature with artificial lighting that just makes me feel terrible, right? And I am so removed from that natural world. But the natural world is where I get my oxygen. It's where I get the glucose that I need to keep my brain functional. It's how I am healthy and balanced and well, just doing good. It's why I have a home, right? It's why I have clothes to wear. It's how I have the electricity coming into this system here. So, one of the things that's been really big with ecology is integrating it into animal health and human health and ecosystem conditions, because we know that the unhealthier the ecosystem, the more contaminants, the more toxins, the more pollution, the more we see the dysregulation of health of the animals, whether they're natural animals or agricultural animals, and then the dysregulation of humans. And all of this comes down through this idea of ecology. We are having environmental exposures because of the things that are happening in the ecosystems, human driven or otherwise. We're seeing an increase in zoonotic pathogens. We're seeing an increase of public health diseases and concerns. And this is all tied back to we're only as healthy as our ecosystem. So please take some time to go and read and watch whatever they have on that website. Okay, go look through all of that cool information there. Okay, now for our understanding, in order to move through our understanding of ecology as a whole, we need to talk about the levels of biological organization. If you remember back in chapter 1, biology is a Russian nesting doll of science, where we start small and we kind of build up from there. Well, within the ecological levels, it's the same thing. So we start small with individual organisms, and we can then zoom out to the biosphere as a whole. So we have been doing a lot of this all semester. We have been talking about organismal ecology all semester because this is talking about adaptations to the environment, right? This is talking about how organisms do get photosynthesis, right? Cellular respiration, how organisms are going to reproduce and fitness. Okay. And then we've been talking about populations as well, with talking about genetics and evolution and a lot of those aspects. When we start looking at higher levels ecology, that's where we get into community, where we start seeing these interactions between organisms, predator-prey, for instance, what I went and did my master's in, or even ecosystem, where we talk about the nutrient cycle, so decomposers and the role that they play. And then finally, the biosphere. Okay, we are all part of the world. We are all part of one globe, and we cannot ignore the different component parts that make up the whole. So we're going to get into these ecological levels and kind of talk a little bit more about community and ecosystem and biosphere in chapters 31 and 32. But I wanted to just preface that here by giving us some of that background. Let's talk about ecology as a biological science. I had mentioned already that this is both an observational and experimental science. So the goal is to do different things where we can actually modify ecosystems. So for instance, this is an image of someone who's looking at clear cutting forests as compared to leaving them be alone. This dotted line down the middle is kind of a line of demarcation where they had clear cut forest and then they had left it alone. And so they're looking at different like plant population densities. We can get permissions to do those things. We can, see fires that happen. We can see floods that happen. We can go through where a volcano erupted. But we can also go through and modify those sciences themselves. We can do experimental sciences. The basic goal of ecology is to explain and predict distribution and abundance of population. So we're looking at how fire plays a role in maintaining the health of a diverse ecosystem. We're looking at how introduced predators might change the gene pool of organisms and result in an extinction of a species. We're not going to necessarily introduce those predators. I'm not going to go in and introduce a species just to see what happens. But if something is there, then I can go and look at that. I might go out and remove those individuals in some parts and have it kind of cordoned off so I can study what changes happen over time. So ecology is really fun because you can do a little bit of everything, which is why I think I was drawn to it so much. Okay, here's our first check your understanding, just some basic going through. One of the things that I want you to work on, because this is going to be on your cumulative final, is this kind of comprehensive connections we've been working through all semester. So think about what's been covered for each unit, explain how it could be ecology. So if you pull that in, it's going to be really helpful. Okay. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit and we're going to look at population ecology so that when we talk about communities, we understand that. If you remember, populations are groups of individuals in the same area that are like breeding over time, okay? Populations change over time as a result of whatever those natural selection pressures may be. It could be things with like sexual selection, it could be movement of individuals, it could be environmental instability, but populations are really variable and they're going to change over time. Populations are where we see that evolution occurring then. Remember, individuals are under natural selection and they leave behind those better adapted individuals with those higher fitness. Population ecology is really fascinating stuff. So I have a little infographic here that talks about some of the things that we would study in population ecology, things like population density, how many individuals are in an area over time, right? Dispersion, how are individuals interacting with one another? Where do I find them in an ecosystem? How are they moving in that ecosystem? We might look at survivor and reproduction and population demography, and we do this as humans too, right? You'll hear sometimes about how the human population is growing, and in some parts of the world, it's growing faster than others, or we're seeing declines in populations over time, and that's all still tying to population ecology. So all of these things play a role, and it allows us to look at things like life history traits and fitness trade-offs, because organisms are going to have to make decisions, and populations play a role in that decision making. If you can eat a food source that no one else can eat, right, you might have an adaptive trait that's going to allow you to change over time. But that's going to be something that you have to deal with in the face of environmental instability. So when we're looking at populations, populations don't just grow out of control constantly. At a certain point in time, populations hit some sort of limiting factor. Now, we don't want, as ecologists, right, or even in this system as a whole, we don't want anything to be dominated by any single individual organism. Any sort of monoculture of that sort is going to reduce biodiversity, and biodiversity is good, right? We want genetic diversity, we want different individuals, we want variability in a population. So populations, when they get to certain sizes, or even if they're not certain sizes, are always going to be subject to loss of individuals. Population growth is regulated in two different ways. The first way would be density independent factors, okay? Density independent factors are going to be things that does not matter how large the population is. These are the things that we would see along with genetic drift, right? Abiotic factors, weather or natural disasters, drought or fire, flooding, tornadoes. Everyone's at equal risk, and it's just a chance whether or not you survive. This in and itself does not regulate population size, but you can imagine that if you have a drought that kills off any drought non-resistant plants, so plants that cannot handle those dry conditions, it's going to change the diversity of that population. You might then see some individuals who are selected for or are able to then survive with that genetic drift, and we're going to see changes in that population over time. The intensity of the effect does not increase with increased population size. What this means is it does not matter if you are a small population or a large population. Everyone is at equal chance of dying from a forest fire. Okay, this is something that we absolutely see happening, and it's really important. Okay, we see, flash floods, and it's going to shake up that kind of genetic diversity, that biodiversity in that population, but it's not controlling and keeping any one group of individual organisms in check, unlike our density dependent factors. So with fungus, if you remember back to our fungal chapter, we did talk a little bit about things like chytrid and white nose syndrome. Those are diseases. Diseases are often involved in density dependent factors. So the more densely populated a hibernacula is with bats, the larger proportion of bats we would expect to be infected with the white nose fungus. Okay, this played a role like in COVID. When you talk about human density, right? During COVID, New York City was absolutely devastated. People live very close to one another. It's a very highly populated city. We heard a lot about New York City with COVID. We didn't hear a lot about Wyoming, because your population density of humans in Wyoming is very, very sparse, very low comparatively. Populations are going to be controlled because of things like competition, because of things like predation, because of things like parasitism. These are all considered biotic factors or living factors. Okay, abiotic factors, density independent. Biotic factors, density dependent. The number of individuals in a population is going to depend on how bad that factor could be, that effect. So I have two images here. On the one image, we see a bunch of rabbits around a watering hole. That ground around the rabbits, it's a black and white image, but it's going to be very dusty, very devoid of vegetation. This is Australia, and Australia actually had still has an invasive rabbit problem. So rabbits were introduced to Australia and their populations exploded. They actually ate a lot of the vegetation down to nothing, which is then resulting in starvation, competition for food sources, and diseases in those rabbit populations. The higher the density of the rabbits, the less food there is, the more death as a result of that. Okay? Other things, like on this other side here, we have a kestrel. This is an American kestrel eating a meadow vole, the animal I studied in my master's research. And we actually see that when vole populations are high, we'll see an increase in predator populations like kestrels. And that's going to be a really good thing for that. So it's going to increase the growth of that population. So density dependent factors aren't always bad. We do tend to think about them in bad ways a lot of the times, but it's not always the case. Okay? How these organisms deal with these density-dependent and density-independent factors is going to result in what we call life history trade-offs or fitness trade-offs, okay? Remember, energy is minimal, okay? You only have so much. Whatever energy you produce, you can't spend it on both making babies and avoiding predation. It's one or the other. So organisms have to make decisions, and they're not consciously, making pros and cons columns and writing those things out. Instead, what we find is that organisms fall along a continuum of life history trade-offs or fitness trade-offs. They occur because that energy restriction. There are two extremes where we're going to have opportunistic or equilibrium species, but everything kind of falls in the middle. What does that mean? Well, if I have high fecundity, meaning I'm making a ton of offspring, okay, I can't make a ton of really large offspring, but I could make a ton of really small offspring. That's a trade-off. That being said, those offspring being small means they don't have as much energy maybe to start, and it means that I might not have a high survivorship of those individuals. Think about mice, for instance. Mice are a great example for this. Mice are going to be very small, right? They have fairly short lifespans, maybe 2 years if they're lucky. They reproduce like crazy, and they're eaten by just about everything, okay? Their trade-off is reproducing like crazy and then having a short lifespan. That really works for them, okay? They're on that life history continuum where they have low survivorship and high fecundity or high fitness. On the other end, though, we have things like elephants. Elephants take a really long time to have babies. 22 months they are pregnant, and then they raise those babies for 5 to 6 years before they even consider getting pregnant again. That's a really long generational time, but elephant babies generally survive to adulthood. So we don't have a high reproductive rate, a high fitness rate, in that we're reproducing a ton, which is fecundity, but we do have really high survivorship of the offspring we do make. Okay, so these are the trade-offs. Things fall along that continuum. Somewhere in that range, we'll find most of these organisms falling. Let's talk about the two extremes because they're interesting. Okay, our opportunistic life history pattern. These are going to be the individuals that are small with a short lifespan. They mature really fast. They reproduce really quickly, but they reproduce with very small offspring with little to no parental care. Think insects, think weeds, think mice. They generally have a high dispersal capacity, and you can have a ton of individuals in a population over time. They are often going to be regulated by density-independent effects because they spread so quickly when they are in those environments. These guys are more likely to survive changing environments because we have those fast generational turnovers. Think back to that E. coli experiment by Harvard Medical. We see that they are able to adapt to those environmental pressures very quickly because they are reproducing very quickly, right? You can have accumulation of mutations over time very fast in very short generations. Unlike our equilibrium history patterns, okay? Equilibrium species are going to be large individuals with long lifespans. They're slow to mature. They have few offspring, and they have a lot of care to their offspring. Generally speaking, we're going to see long, slow growth. The populations tend to be at the maximum of what the ecosystem can support. Think about those bears, right? Back to Fat Bear Week when we were talking about fat bears. They're in close proximity to one another only during the salmon run. The rest of the year, they are not hanging out. They are not friends. They are, very much in their own space. They are slow to mature, right? Baby bears are with their parents for many, many years. Birds, mammals, right? Humans even fall into this. And our population is regulated by density dependent effects, things like disease, things like competition for food sources. For anyone who was following Fat Bear Week in 2025, the Chunk 32, had a broken jaw because of competition from these density dependent factors, this work to find a mate. So these species are more likely to go extinct in the change of changing environments, especially if those environments change very quickly. We're not going to see the same response to like antibiotic resistance in bacteria if we're looking at things like bears. If there's no food for the bears, there's no more salmon, they're just not going to do very well. And they'll probably go extinct because if they can't switch their diets, that's what they've got. They're not getting enough energy, and we're going to see fitness decrease as a result. Okay? That being said, extinctions are normal. Okay? Extinctions are the total disappearance of a species or a group. And I know I talked about mass extinctions in Unit 4 a little bit. Extinctions are normal. If a species cannot adapt, if you do not have good fitness, if you do not have traits that allow you to survive, you are likely to go extinct. However, okay, this is the big caveat there. We as humans are speeding up extinction rates by potentially 100 to 1,000 times what it should be. When you have habitat intolerance, right, your habitat changed. The ice caps are melting and the polar bears can't get enough food. That's not the polar bear's fault. That's going to be because of things like climate change. So when we look at extinctions, like what causes extinctions, okay, sure, asteroid strikes absolutely cause extinctions, right? Climate change, where we had the ice age and then the ice age melted, absolutely. But humans have been directly responsible for the extinction of many species, including things like the dodo, including things like the passenger pigeon. We are actually responsible for things like the spread of the chytrid fungus and the white nose fungus, which is causing extinctions, local extinctions at the minimum, of some of those bat and frog species. Lack of genetic diversity, that's also us, usually because of hunting. Pollution is a big one. Invasive species, loss of habitat results in lack of food. Like, a lot of these things, unfortunately, are tied back to the egocentric viewpoint of humans, where we're the top of the food chain, we're the big kahuna, we're the end all be all. But that's not really the case, and that's not a healthy way to think about our place in this planet. So, with that being said, that's the end of chapter 30. Pretty short and sweet. We're going to get into chapter 31 and talk more about these community interactions and ecosystems as a whole. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you very much.